When I first saw the listing for the 100-year-old Lakehouse, I knew it was the one, nestled on the edge of a glimmering lake, with towering oaks casting dappled shadows across the weathered wooden porch. It was the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time. The creaky floorboards, the faded floral wallpaper, and the stone fireplace weren't flaws. They were character. I could almost hear the whispers of decades past, stories of families, summer vacations, and laughter carried by the wind over the lake. The price was reasonable for such a property, especially in an area where most houses were modern, cookie-cutter constructions under the strict eyes of a nearby HOA. I had been searching for years, scrolling endlessly through listings, attending open houses that all felt sterile and lifeless. But this lake house had history, and history spoke to me in ways that glossy new builds never could. I made the call immediately, and within days, I was on my way to meet the owner, an elderly man who had lived there his whole life and was now ready to pass it on. He spoke with a gentle nostalgia as he walked me through the rooms, pointing out the spots where the old tree had scratched the siding, or where he had once hung a swing for his grandchildren. The paperwork moved quickly. I had the funds, the inspector approved, and I signed the dotted line. That day, I became the owner of the lake house, a piece of history that felt like it had been waiting just for me. I imagined summers spent kayaking on the lake, cozy winter nights by the fireplace, and afternoons of quiet reflection in the sunroom that looked out over the water. I felt a deep connection to the place, like I had finally found home. It wasn't until I received the first letter from the HOA that the dream began to crack. The envelope was thick, formal, stamped with the HOA logo and the words, "Notice of Violation." My heart sank as I read the contents. Apparently, the HOA claimed that my lake house, despite its age and historical roots, was subject to their rules and regulations. They listed issues I had never been informed of: minor structural repairs, landscaping requirements, and most notably, the supposed fact that my property was encroaching on their community easement. The tone was authoritarian, even threatening. They demanded compliance within 30 days or face legal action. I felt a rush of disbelief and frustration. How could this be? The lake house had existed for a century, long before the HOA had even formed. I tried calling their office, leaving messages, but the only response I received was a curt voicemail from a woman identifying herself as Karen, the HOA board president. She insisted I was violating the community guidelines and that failure to comply would result in eviction proceedings. Eviction over a house that had stood there for 100 years. Karen quickly became the face of the conflict. In every interaction, she projected an air of authority mixed with smugness, a belief that the house rules were absolute, untouchable. She even hinted that I was lucky the board was willing to negotiate at all, implying that they could escalate the situation to the courts with ease. It was infuriating. I felt like I was being bullied for owning something that was mine by right of history and law. Determined not to be intimidated, I began digging into the property records, historical deeds, and old maps. That's when I discovered something incredible, something that made my blood run cold, and my heart pound with exhilaration. The land that the HOA now occupied, the very ground they claimed gave them authority over my lake house, was actually part of my property. The original surveys from over a century ago clearly showed the lake house plot extending farther than I had realized, and the HOA's development had been built partially on what had always been my land. It was the perfect twist. Life suddenly felt like one of those stories, where the underdog finds a hidden advantage, just when all hope seems lost. Suddenly the tables were turning. Karen and her HOA didn't just threaten me, they were unknowingly sitting on land that legally belonged to me. The idea of confronting her, of reclaiming what was mine, filled me with a mix of giddy anticipation and righteous anger. But I couldn't rush it. This wasn't just about proving a point, it was about strategy. If I acted too soon, it might backfire. I began carefully collecting evidence. Old land surveys, photographs, witness statements from long-time locals who remembered when the lake house was the only property on that side of the lake. Every document, every scrap of proof, became a weapon in my growing arsenal. I realized that I wasn't just fighting for a house, I was fighting for justice, history, and a principle that no HOA, no matter how smug or overbearing, could override. As I sat on the porch that evening, the sun dipping behind the lake and painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, I felt a strange combination of serenity and determination. The wind whispered through the oaks, carrying with it the echoes of the past, and the promise of what was to come. I knew the battle with Karan was only beginning, but for the first time, I also knew that I held the power. The lake house wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a claim, a legacy, and soon, it would be victory. After the surveyor formally marked the boundaries of my property, I thought the HOA might back off. I was wrong. Karan didn't retreat. She doubled down. The very next week, I noticed freshly painted no trespassing signs going up along the edge of my property. They were ugly metal plaques, bolted into the ground, right where my survey stakes clearly indicated the boundary. It was a deliberate act of intimidation, meant to make me doubt my claim. But I refused to be rattled. Every sign was a reminder of just how far she would go to cling to authority she didn't rightfully possess. Karen's emails escalated as well. Every day, my inbox flooded with aggressive messages. She accused me of harassment, of violating community spirit, and even insinuated that I was somehow endangering the neighborhood. One email suggested that legal action was imminent, though she couldn't specify how the HOA could take action on land they didn't own. I started keeping detailed records of every correspondence, knowing that each interaction might later serve as evidence. Then came the most audacious stunt yet. One morning, I drove up to find a large truck parked near the edge of my property. Contractors, apparently hired by Karen, were surveying what they claimed was HOA land. They had heavy equipment ready, seemingly preparing to dig or install fencing. I walked up, calmly identifying myself and showing them the official survey documents. At first, they hesitated, confused, but one of the men shrugged. "We were just told to follow orders," he said. The absurdity of it struck me. Karen had literally sent workers onto my land without legal authority, acting as though the surveyor's official markers didn't exist. I took photos, notes, and even video of the confrontation. This was no longer a private dispute, was becoming a matter of public record, and Karen's overreach was becoming indisputable proof of her recklessness. I realized that if handled correctly, this could force the HOA to back down completely and expose her tactics to the neighborhood and possibly the media. Speaking of the media, I decided it was time to get professional advice. I contacted a local real estate attorney, explaining the situation and showing the historical documents. The lawyer's eyes widened as she examined the century-old survey maps. "This is remarkable," she said. "It's extremely rare to find a case where an HOA has inadvertently built on private land. You have overwhelming evidence. Legally, you have a strong position to reclaim what's yours, and you could even pursue damages for trespassing." Emboldened by this confirmation, I began planning the next step. Karen was aggressive and public humiliation might be her only leverage, so I considered turning the tables in a way that would make her threats powerless. I started documenting everything: emails, texts, photos, videos of the survey markers, historical maps, and witnesses from the community who remembered the lake house long before the HOA existed. Every piece of evidence added weight to my position, and I could feel the sense of inevitability building. Meanwhile, Karen became increasingly erratic. I overheard her complaining to board members in hushed, angry tones. Her confident veneer was slipping. The board was beginning to whisper, unsure how to handle a property owner who had irrefutable proof that their authority was being exercised over land they didn't legally own. I knew the cracks were appearing, and it was only a matter of time before she panicked publicly. One afternoon, I invited a local historian, an elderly woman who had lived in the area her entire life, to walk the property with me. She confirmed everything I had discovered. The Lakehouse land had been well documented as privately owned long before the HOA even existed. She even recounted stories of the original owners marking the property lines by the lake, memories passed down through generations. I filmed her testimony, a living record that added an undeniable human element to the cold, bureaucratic documents. As weeks passed, tension between me and Karen escalated. Her emails grew more frantic, her tone desperate. I refused to engage directly beyond polite, factual responses, knowing that any rash reaction on my part could be spun against me. Instead, I focused on building a comprehensive case. The irony was delicious. Karen had tried to intimidate me with threats of eviction, but her own mismanagement and overreach were documenting her downfall in real time. Then, the perfect opportunity presented itself. A local lifestyle reporter had called, curious about rumors of a century-old lake house owner in conflict with the HOA. I shared my story carefully, emphasizing the history, the legal facts, and the overreach by the HOA, without mentioning Karen's personal attacks in an inflammatory way. The journalist was intrigued, promising to cover the story as a human interest piece. The idea that this could become public, showing the HOA's error and Karen's attempts at intimidation, was thrilling. I felt the tide shifting. That evening, I stood on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the lake once again. The water shimmered golden, reflecting not just the sky, but the sense of justice I was beginning to feel. Karen may have tried to bully me, threaten me, and trespass on my property, but the truth was undeniable. Every deed, every survey, every witness lined up in my favor. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I could see a clear path to victory, and Karen would have no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. A week after the reporter's call, the tension hit a new peak. Karen sent an official notice from the HOA's attorney, threatening legal action if I did not comply with their demands. The letter was formal, intimidating, and filled with legal jargon designed to frighten me into submission. It demanded that I remove the dock, trim my shrubs to HOA specifications, and even pay a fine for violations dating back months. Reading it, I felt the familiar rush of anger, but also a quiet satisfaction. I had anticipated this. Karen had crossed into legal territory, and I was fully prepared to meet her there. I immediately contacted my real estate attorney, who assured me that the HOA's threats were baseless. They can't enforce rules on land they don't own, she explained. Any attempt to do so, especially sending contractors onto your property, could be considered trespassing or harassment. You're in a very strong position here. Her confidence gave me clarity. This wasn't just about standing my ground anymore, it was about documenting every misstep Karen made, so her attempts to intimidate me could work against her. Meanwhile, word of the dispute began to spread through the neighborhood. Some neighbors had noticed the newly installed survey stakes and the no trespassing signs that were so obviously on my property. Curious glances and hushed conversations followed me wherever I went. Karen tried to control the narrative, sending emails to the community claiming I was causing unrest and challenging established rules. But her message was weak against the weight of the historical documents and local testimonies I had gathered. To counter Karen's attempts at manipulation, I decided to take proactive measures. I organized a small gathering on my property, inviting longtime residents who remembered the Lakehouse long before the HOA existed. We walked the boundary lines, shared stories, and recorded everything on video. The historian I had previously consulted also joined, providing testimony about the original land survey and the Lakehouse's historical significance. This wasn't just a private victory, it was becoming a public affirmation of my rightful claim. Karen predictably did not attend. Instead, she sent another round of emails to the HOA board, warning them that I was mobilizing the neighborhood and that my actions might create liability for the community. I suspected that she was panicking. The board members were beginning to murmur among themselves, uncertain how to deal with a property owner who had both the legal upper hand and public support. The media involvement added another layer of pressure. The lifestyle reporter returned with questions, seeking details for an article about the historic Lakehouse and the unusual conflict with the HOA. I provided the full story, from my initial purchase to Karen's escalating threats, while carefully presenting the evidence. I emphasized the history, the survey maps, and the local witness accounts, without turning it into a personal vendetta. The journalist's interests elevated the stakes, and I knew that public scrutiny would limit Karen's ability to act recklessly. The following day, I received a call from a neighbor I had never met before. Someone who had lived on the outskirts of the HOA for decades. They confessed that they had always been wary of Karen's authoritarian tendencies, but had been too intimidated to speak up. Now, after seeing my actions and the documents, they were willing to testify if necessary. It was another piece of the puzzle, strengthening my position and further isolating Karen. Karen's responses became increasingly erratic. Emails were sent at odd hours, filled with exclamation points and demands, her tone shifting from confidence to desperation. It was clear she had no legal ground, yet she tried to bluff her way forward. Every message became a record of her overreach, and I made sure to archive everything meticulously. I was playing the long game. This wasn't about immediate victory. It was about ensuring the outcome was undeniable, permanent, and public. One evening, I received yet another surprise. A notice from the local zoning office, triggered by complaints from the HOA. I smiled as I read it. The office confirmed that all constructions on my property were compliant with zoning laws and that the HOA's claims were unfounded. This was the final official validation I needed. Legally, historically, and publicly, the Lakehouse and surrounding land were mine. As I stood on the porch that night, the moon reflecting on the calm lake, I felt an extraordinary sense of control. Karen's threats had escalated to legal maneuvers, but every move she made was documented and contradicted by irrefutable evidence. The power dynamics had shifted entirely. She had tried to bully me, but I was no longer the underdog. The Lakehouse was mine, and soon, Karen and her HOA would have no choice but to accept it. But I knew the final confrontation was approaching. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly, and I needed to prepare for the moment when the HOA would finally have to face the truth in a public and undeniable way. The Lakehouse had survived a century, weathering storms and the passage of time. Now, it would survive Karan's threats too, and when the dust settled, justice and perhaps a little poetic karma would be mine. Karan's desperation became painfully obvious in the following days. She sent out a glossy newsletter to every household in the community, filled with dramatic language accusing me of disrupting harmony and ignoring community rules. She attached photographs of my property, carefully cropped, to make it appear as if I was trespassing on HOA land. I could feel the tension rising in the neighborhood. Some neighbors were concerned, others curious, and a few who had once supported her now looked uncertain. I knew I had to respond, but not with anger. I decided to take the moral and legal high ground. I organized a small neighborhood meeting on my property, inviting anyone interested to come and see the facts firsthand. Flyers were discreetly handed out, emphasizing transparency and history rather than conflict. The message was simple. I owned the Lakehouse land. The HOA had unknowingly built on it, and the truth needed to be acknowledged before anyone made assumptions. The day of the meeting, I was both nervous and excited. People trickled in, curious and cautious. I had laid out maps, historical surveys, and photographs that documented the Lakehouse's boundaries over the last century. My historian friend narrated the story, explaining the original ownership and how the Lakehouse predates the HOA. The evidence was clear, visual, and undeniable. Neighbors leaned in, asking questions, taking notes, and some even recording parts of the discussion on their phones. Karen, predictably, did not attend. She had the chance to confront the evidence directly, but chose instead to stay in her office, probably plotting her next move. That absence spoke volumes to the crowd. Without her presence, her credibility weakened further, while my transparency and preparedness bolstered mine. By the end of the meeting, several neighbors expressed support for my claim and admitted privately that Karen had often overstepped her authority. It was clear the balance of power was shifting. After the meeting, I strategically posted a carefully worded summary online in the community's private forum, emphasizing facts and historical evidence rather than personal attacks. The post gained attention quickly. People were sharing their own recollections, posting old photographs, and recounting stories about the Lakehouse and its place in the neighborhood's history. Karen's attempts to control the narrative were failing spectacularly. Not willing to concede, she escalated further. I soon noticed additional warning signs going up near the edge of my property, another attempt to intimidate me visually and sow confusion among neighbors. This time, I responded decisively. I documented each sign, photographed the survey stakes next to them, and sent a polite but firm notice to the HOA and Karen personally. The signs were on my land, and continued encroachment would be considered trespassing. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Some homeowners felt caught in the middle, worried about the conflict affecting property values or their own standing in the community. Others quietly supported my claim, but feared retaliation. I made it clear that I had no intention of causing harm or conflict. My goal was simple: justice. The Lakehouse had stood for a century, and no HOA or overbearing president had the right to challenge its ownership or history. With media interest already brewing from the journalist, I realized it was time for a public statement. I coordinated with the reporter to share the history, the legal facts, and the neighborhood context in a way that was engaging but factual. The article would highlight not just the conflict but the cultural and historical value of the Lakehouse. Karen's overreach was being exposed publicly, and her credibility continued to crumble as facts stacked up against her. By the end of the week, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The HOA board was quietly meeting, their usual confidence eroded. Karen had no strategy that would withstand public scrutiny, historical records, and legal validation. Even her supporters were beginning to doubt her leadership. I felt a surge of vindication every time I walked along the Lakehouse boundaries, seeing the survey markers proudly standing against the encroaching signs she had placed. That evening I sat on the porch, the lake reflecting the fading light, feeling a rare mixture of calm and anticipation. The next move was crucial. Karen would likely attempt one final legal maneuver or public stunt to regain authority, but I was ready. Every document, witness, and piece of media attention was aligned in my favor. I knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt certain that victory was not just possible, it was inevitable. As the stars emerged above the water, I realized that this fight wasn't just about a house or property lines. It was about integrity, history, and standing firm when faced with intimidation. The century-old Lakehouse had endured storms, floods, and the passage of time. Now, it would endure Karen's overreach and come out stronger on the other side. The day arrived when Karen finally decided to escalate her tactics to the next level. I received a thick envelope from the HOA's attorney, this time containing a formal legal filing. They claimed I was violating HOA covenants and demanded immediate compliance, citing fines, potential court appearances, and even the threat of removal from the property. The language was aggressive, meant to intimidate and overwhelm. But I had anticipated this move and remained composed. Every prior step I had taken, the surveys, photographs, historical records, witness statements, was about to render their threats meaningless. I immediately contacted my real estate attorney, who reviewed the filing with a practiced eye. Her face grew increasingly serious as she flipped through the pages. "This is laughable," she said finally, shaking her head. "They have no legal standing. All the claims are based on the assumption that their HOA jurisdiction extends onto land they don't own. And with your evidence, you're fully protected. You could even countersue for trespassing and harassment." Armed with this confirmation, I began strategizing my next move. This wasn't just about responding legally, it was about taking control of the narrative. Karen had tried to intimidate, bully, and manipulate the neighborhood. But now the law and history were squarely on my side. It was time to make a public demonstration that would leave no doubt about the truth. In the days that followed, the tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. Some neighbors, who had previously been neutral or hesitant, began reaching out to me privately. They expressed concern about Karen's aggressive tactics and curiosity about the legitimacy of my claim. I shared with them the old maps and surveys, as well as stories from longtime residents who remembered the Lakehouse long before the HOA had existed. The more they saw, the more they understood that Karen's authority was based on misconception rather than fact. Karen, of course, did not remain idle. She attempted to rally support from the board, sending more emails warning of legal and financial consequences if residents acknowledged my claims publicly. Her tone grew increasingly desperate, yet the more she tried to assert control, the more isolated she became. Even some of her longtime allies began questioning her judgment, privately admitting that the evidence I had gathered was compelling. I decided to prepare a grand reveal for the neighborhood. Using the maps, photos, surveys, and witness statements, I created a detailed presentation that would clearly illustrate the true boundaries of the Lakehouse property. I wanted everyone to see, in no uncertain terms, that the HOA's claims were unfounded and that Karen had been operating under a serious misapprehension, albeit one she had compounded with aggressive intimidation. When the day arrived, I invited the community to a gathering on my property. I positioned the survey stakes, marked the boundaries, and displayed the maps and historical photos on easels. Neighbors arrived cautiously, unsure what to expect. I began the presentation calmly, narrating the history of the Lakehouse and the surrounding land. I showed the original deeds, pointed out the discrepancies with the HOA's boundaries, and included video testimony from residents who had lived in the area for decades. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Gasps and murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd as the evidence unfolded. People compared the markers and maps to what they had long believed about the neighborhood's layout. Many were stunned to realize that the HOA had, unknowingly, built on land that wasn't theirs. Karen's credibility eroded visibly in real time, as neighbors turned to each other, questioning what they had been told for years. Meanwhile, Karen attempted to attend the meeting, but her presence only drew attention to her increasingly erratic behavior. She lingered at the edge of the gathering, muttering about rules and authority, But the facts were undeniable. I maintained my composure, presenting each piece of evidence clearly and calmly, allowing the truth to speak for itself. Every attempt she made to interrupt or assert control was easily countered by the survey markers and historical documents. By the end of the gathering, the outcome was clear. The neighborhood now understood the full scope of the situation. Karen had lost her moral authority. Her overreach had been exposed, and the evidence of the Lakehouse's rightful ownership was incontrovertible. Conversations buzzed with disbelief, curiosity, and admiration for the meticulous way the evidence had been presented. I could see Karen retreating, realizing that her legal threats and intimidation had failed completely. That evening, as I stood on the porch, watching the lake shimmer in the fading sunlight, I felt a deep sense of triumph. The legal filing that had been meant to intimidate me had instead catalyzed a full-scale revelation of truth. Karen's attempts to control the neighborhood, enforce non-existent rules, and bully a rightful property owner had backfired spectacularly. The lake house wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of resilience, justice, and historical integrity. The next step, I knew, would be formalizing my legal position even further, ensuring that no future HOA board could ever challenge the boundaries of my property. But for now, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. The century-old lake house had survived time, storms, and even Karen's aggressive tactics, and tonight, it had survived triumphantly. Karen wasn't finished. The day after the neighborhood meeting, I received notice that she had retained a high-powered outside law firm. Their letters were more formal, more intimidating, filled with complex legal jargon and warnings of potential lawsuits. The language was calculated to unsettle me and intimidate my neighbors. But I had anticipated this move. I read the documents carefully, noting each claim, every attempt to assert authority over land that wasn't theirs. I smiled quietly. The more aggressive Karen became, the more evidence she provided of her own overreach. I immediately forwarded the correspondence to my attorney. She reviewed it with a keen eye, highlighting weaknesses and inconsistencies in the HOA's arguments. "They're grasping at straws," she said. "None of their claims have merit because the property lines are clear and you have historical documentation to prove it. In fact, they're building a record of harassment against themselves." The reassurance gave me renewed confidence. The stage was set for a confrontation that could not be ignored or dismissed. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood that Karen had escalated the matter to an external law firm. Whispers, hushed conversations, and curiosity swirled around my property. Some neighbors approached me cautiously, expressing concern over potential legal chaos, while others expressed support, noting the meticulous evidence I had collected. I realized that public perception was becoming just as important as legal facts. Karen's aggressive behavior had alienated many residents, and her decision to bring in outside counsel was only fueling suspicion and doubt. To maintain control of the narrative, I invited the community to another gathering, this time focused on transparency and historical context rather than confrontation. One displayed enlarged survey maps, old photographs, and copies of the original deeds, clearly showing the lake house boundaries versus the HOA's current claims. I even brought in a professional land surveyor to explain the legal and technical details of property lines and easements. The neighbors listened attentively, many nodding as the truth became unmistakably clear. Meanwhile, Karen tried to intimidate through social media and HOA communications, sending emails to residents painting me as difficult and disruptive. But the facts were already widely known. Her attempts at influence were faltering, and her credibility was eroding in real time. Residents began questioning the HOA's authority and her leadership, some even suggesting that the board should step in and address the reality of the property boundaries. I continued documenting every action, email, and public communication. Each attempt by Karen to manipulate or threaten became evidence of harassment and overreach. I knew that if the dispute escalated to court, these records would not only protect me, but also expose the HOA's mismanagement. I felt a quiet satisfaction as I watched the situation unfold. Each move she made only strengthened my position. The pressure on Karen and the board was mounting. Private meetings among HOA members grew tense and contentious. Some admitted privately that they had doubts about her decisions, recognizing the strength of the historical evidence and the growing support for my claim. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down, sending increasingly frantic messages that were often contradictory, revealing her uncertainty and desperation. I realized that the perfect moment was approaching to solidify my victory. By combining public exposure, historical evidence, and legal validation, I could corner the HOA into acknowledging the land boundaries formally. The Lakehouse, which had endured a century of time and neglect, was now poised to withstand bureaucratic overreach. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation, one that would leave no room for Karen's bluffing or intimidation tactics. That evening, I walked along the Lakehouse property, the water reflecting the twilight sky. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had my confidence. I had carefully prepared, documented every angle, and gained the support of neighbors who now understood the truth. Karen's outside counsel could write all the threatening letters they wanted, but the facts, the law, and the community's acknowledgement were all aligned in my favor. The next move was crucial, and I was ready. Karen's desperation reached a new peak the following week. She orchestrated a small community meeting at the HOA office, ostensibly to discuss neighborhood rules. But everyone knew the real agenda: to intimidate me and assert her control. Flyers were distributed in the community, painted in bold letters, warning residents of an illegal encroachment and urging them to attend. It was clear she hoped a public display would pressure me into compliance, or at least sway neighbors to her side. I decided not to confront her directly at the office. Instead, I prepared a clever strategy that would make her spectacle backfire spectacularly. I sent a formal invitation to the media, presenting it as a historical and legal exposition about the Lakehouse boundaries. Along with the local journalist who had already shown interest, I reached out to a neighborhood blogger and a community newsletter editor. The goal was simple: ensure that truth and transparency dominated the event rather than Karen's attempts at manipulation. When the day arrived, I set up near the Lakehouse instead of going to the HOA office. I laid out enlarged copies of century-old maps, historical deeds, and photographs, and even installed markers showing the true boundaries of the property. As neighbors arrived, they were greeted by a clear and visual explanation of the facts, presented calmly and confidently. I welcomed questions, allowed comparisons of survey stakes to historical maps, and explained the timeline of the property's ownership in detail. Karen showed up, flustered and visibly angry, expecting to assert dominance. She tried to interrupt, waving papers and shouting about community rules and fines, but I calmly guided the crowd to the survey stakes and documents. One by one, neighbors could see for themselves that the Lakehouse land clearly exceeded the HOA boundaries, and the stakes demonstrated that any violations she claimed were on my legally owned property. The more she shouted, the more it became clear that her authority was unfounded. The media presence amplified the effect. Cameras recorded the survey markers, the historical maps, and the statements from longtime residents who remembered the Lakehouse long before the HOA existed. Karen's attempts to dominate the conversation were drowned out by factual evidence and public scrutiny. Every verbal threat she made, every accusation of disruption, was rendered powerless in the face of irrefutable proof. By the end of the event, the narrative had shifted completely. Neighbors who had once feared the HOA's authority were now openly acknowledging my claim. Some even congratulating me privately for the meticulous preparation and the courage to stand up. Karen, sensing her defeat, retreated to her office, her face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The spectacle she had intended to use against me had instead cemented my position publicly, and her credibility was in tatters. I documented everything: photographs, video, and statements from attendees. This evidence would be invaluable if the HOA or Karen tried further legal action, ensuring that any attempt to challenge my property rights would be met with overwhelming proof. More importantly, it created a historical record of the event, a public affirmation of the Lakehouse's rightful ownership. That evening, I walked along the Lakehouse property, surveying the survey stakes that clearly defined the land boundaries. The lake reflected the sunset in golden streaks, and I felt a deep sense of triumph. Karen's public spectacle had not only failed, it had cemented my position in the eyes of the neighborhood. I realized that patience, careful preparation, and transparency were far more powerful than aggression or intimidation. For the first time, I sensed a turning point. The HOA's overreach, Karen's escalating threats, and her attempts at public manipulation had all been neutralized. The Lakehouse had survived centuries of history, and now it had survived bureaucratic intimidation as well. Karen's stubbornness had provided the perfect stage for a public revelation that no one could ignore. As twilight gave way to night, I sat on the porch, reflecting on the battle so far. The Lakehouse wasn't just a home anymore, it had become a symbol of perseverance, justice, and careful preparation in the face of bullying authority. The next step would be formalizing the boundaries legally and ensuring that the HOA could never challenge them again. Karen had lost, and the century-old Lakehouse had won. After the public spectacle at my property, the HOA finally began to realize the gravity of the situation. Their outside legal counsel sent a formal letter requesting a meeting with me, ostensibly to clarify boundaries and resolve the ongoing disputes amicably. I knew this was the first step toward their reluctant acknowledgement. Karen's bluffing had failed spectacularly, and now they were forced to consider the facts seriously. I met with the HOA board in their office, bringing all the documentation, original deeds, century-old survey maps, photographs, witness statements, and video evidence from the public presentation. The board members shuffled nervously in their chairs, glancing at each other as I laid out the facts clearly and methodically. Karen was present, her confident facade slipping as I presented each point with precision. The evidence was overwhelming. There was simply no way for them to dispute the documented history and legal boundaries of my property. I believe it's clear, I said, gesturing to the historical maps, that the Lakehouse land predates the HOA and extends into areas that have been mistakenly claimed. I am happy to work collaboratively, but the boundaries must be recognized formally. The silence in the room was telling. Karen's attempts to interject were quieted by the weight of undeniable evidence and the steady attention of the other board members. After a tense pause, one of the senior board members spoke. Yes. The documents are convincing. It appears there has been an error in the original development. There was no hesitation in his voice, only the cautious acceptance of a truth that had become unavoidable. Karen's face flushed red, a mix of anger and humiliation evident, as her authority was publicly undermined by facts she could neither refute nor hide. I calmly continued, to prevent any future misunderstandings, I suggest a formal record be made acknowledging the accurate property boundaries, including an updated plat file with the county. This will protect both my property and the HOA from future disputes. The board nodded in agreement, and even Karen had little choice but to remain silent. Her attempts to dominate the conversation had been neutralized by careful preparation, historical evidence, and public support. In the following days, the HOA began the process of filing the corrected boundaries with the county. Karen attempted a few last-minute objections, sending legal memos insisting that the land somehow still fell under HOA jurisdiction. I responded with a polite but firm submission of all evidence, demonstrating that further dispute would be futile. Each letter she sent only highlighted the strength of my position and the futility of her resistance. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The HOA had officially acknowledged the Lakehouse boundaries. Many residents approached me, congratulating me on my diligence and persistence. They expressed relief that the long-standing conflict had finally been clarified, and praised the careful and transparent way I had handled the situation. Karen, meanwhile, retreated to her office, her authority and credibility severely diminished. Though the acknowledgement was a major victory, Karen was not finished. She continued to threaten legal action in private emails, attempting to intimidate both me and some board members. But by this point, the momentum was firmly on my side. I had the evidence, the neighborhood support, the media attention, and the historical record, all tools that made further attempts at intimidation ineffective. I knew it was time to solidify the final victory. Filing the formal boundary acknowledgement with the county would create a permanent legal record, ensuring that neither Karen nor any future HOA board could challenge the Lakehouse's property lines again. I coordinated with my attorney, the surveyor, and the local historian to compile every necessary document, making the case airtight. As I stood on the porch of the Lakehouse that evening, watching the sunset reflect across the water, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The battle had been long and stressful, but each move, each carefully documented step, had brought me closer to victory. Karen's threats had only served to strengthen my resolve and provide more evidence of her overreach. The Lakehouse had survived not just time, but bureaucracy and intimidation, and it would endure long into the future, secure in its rightful boundaries. Even after the HOA formally acknowledged the Lakehouse boundaries, Karen wasn't finished. She seemed determined to leave no stone unturned in her attempts to intimidate me. One morning, I received yet another letter from her attorney, this one dripping with urgency and veiled threats. It claimed that the HOA may seek restitution for past disturbances and that I had somehow provoked community unrest. The language was dramatic, intended to unsettle both me and the neighborhood. I read the letter carefully and then calmly forwarded it to my attorney. "This is the last desperate gasp," she said, reviewing the threats. "Legally, they have no standing, and any attempt to pursue this could expose the HOA to counterclaims for harassment and trespassing. We're in an extremely strong position." Her words were reassuring, but I knew that strategy alone wasn't enough. I needed to ensure Karen's final attempt would fail publicly as well as legally. I decided to combine legal preparation with a public statement. I coordinated with a local journalist and neighborhood blogger, planning a controlled reveal of the formal boundary acknowledgement and all supporting evidence. I wanted neighbors to understand that not only was the lake house legally secure, but that Karen's repeated threats were unfounded and had been thoroughly documented. Transparency, I realized, would prevent any last-minute attempts at manipulation. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and I attended with my attorney. Karen entered the room brimming with false confidence, clutching documents and muttering about legal rights and community rules. I remained calm, letting the presence of the historical deeds, survey maps, and county filings speak for themselves. The tension was palpable. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear they had grown weary of Karen's relentless campaign. When Karen tried to speak, I presented my evidence systematically. "These are the historical deeds, survey maps, and official filings with the county," I said, pointing to the documentation. "They clearly demonstrate the boundaries of the Lakehouse property. Any claims suggesting the HOA has authority over these areas are unfounded." Murmurs spread through the room. Neighbors, some attending as observers, could see that Karen's arguments held no weight against documented facts. Karen's voice rose in frustration. "You can't just ignore the HOA's rules," she shouted, her confidence cracking. The board, however, had begun to intervene. "Karen," one member said firmly, "the documents presented are clear. The property boundaries must be respected. Any further attempts to assert jurisdiction could result in legal liability for the HOA." The message was unmistakable. Her power had evaporated. I calmly continued. "For clarity and to prevent future disputes, I request that the HOA distribute an official notice to all residents confirming the Lakehouse property boundaries. This will protect both parties and ensure the facts are on record." Board members nodded, acknowledging the necessity of a formal, community-wide statement. Karen sputtered, but had no recourse. Her repeated attempts at intimidation had left her isolated. Outside the meeting room, I allowed myself a small smile. Karen had tried every tactic: intimidation, legal threats, public spectacle, and manipulation. Each attempt had been countered with clear evidence, transparency, and patience. The neighborhood now understood the truth. The county filings were in place, and the HOA had been forced to recognize the boundaries publicly. Karen's final attempt was not only ineffective, it had highlighted her overreach to the entire community. Over the next few days, the HOA sent out a formal notice to all residents, confirming the correct property boundaries. Karen's name was conspicuously absent from the communication, reflecting her diminished authority. Neighbors who had once been uncertain or intimidated now approached me openly, expressing relief and admiration for the way the situation had been handled. The tide had completely turned. That evening I walked along the Lakehouse property, surveying the markers and reflecting on the journey. Karen's relentless efforts had inadvertently provided a comprehensive record of her overreach. Every threat, letter, and public stunt had strengthened my position and cemented the Lakehouse's rightful place in the community. For the first time in months, I felt a profound sense of peace. The century-old Lakehouse, with its rich history and serene lakefront, had survived storms, bureaucratic battles, and one particularly overzealous HOA president. The property was secure, the neighborhood aware of the facts, and Karen's influence effectively neutralized. I realized that, sometimes, patience, preparation, and transparency were the most powerful tools of all. As the sun set, casting golden reflections across the water, I allowed myself to appreciate the hard-fought victory. The Lakehouse was mine not just legally, but in the hearts and minds of the community. Karen's final attempt to intimidate or assert control had failed spectacularly, and the century-old home stood victorious, a testament to persistence, justice, and careful preparation. With the county filing complete and the HOA publicly acknowledging the boundaries, Karen's influence dwindled rapidly. Her final desperate attempts at intimidation had failed, and her credibility within the community had been all but destroyed. Rumors began circulating among neighbors that she was planning to step down, though she hadn't formally announced anything. I stayed patient, letting the legal and historical facts speak for themselves. A week later, the HOA sent an official notice to residents. Karen had resigned as president, effective immediately. The announcement was terse, devoid of fanfare, but the message was clear: her reign was over. It was both a relief and a victory. Months of conflict, threats, and tension had culminated in a decisive conclusion. The century-old Lakehouse, its land, and its history had been fully recognized. Karen's attempts to dominate and intimidate were finally behind me. Neighbors reacted quickly. Those who had been uncertain or silent began visiting, offering congratulations, and expressing admiration for how the situation had been handled. Many remarked on the professionalism, patience, and careful documentation that had ultimately won the day. I realized that the public acknowledgement of the property's boundaries had not only protected my land but had also restored confidence in the community. People understood that history, law, and transparency could prevail over intimidation and bureaucratic overreach. With Karen gone, the new HOA leadership was careful, respectful, and cooperative. I attended several meetings as an observer, providing clarification when necessary, but mostly allowing them to operate independently. It was clear that the lessons from the conflict had been internalized. The HOA could no longer overstep boundaries, either literally or figuratively. My property was secure, and the community recognized that fact. The victory gave me the freedom to focus on the Lakehouse itself. I began a careful restoration, working to preserve its historic charm while making it comfortable and functional for modern living. Neighbors stopped by with stories and photographs, offering insight into the house's history and contributing small pieces of knowledge that helped guide the restoration process. Each detail, original woodwork, old fireplaces, lakefront landscaping became part of a larger tapestry connecting past and present. For the first time in months, I could enjoy the serenity of the Lakehouse without fear or distraction. Walking along the shoreline, listening to the water lap against the dock, I felt a sense of peace and accomplishment. The property had endured over a century of storms, neglect, and now bureaucratic challenges. My patience, careful planning, and commitment to truth had ensured that it would continue to stand for generations to come. The neighbors who had witnessed the conflict also became allies and friends. I invited them over for small gatherings, sharing meals and stories about the Lakehouse's past. The atmosphere shifted from tension and division to camaraderie and community. Karen's absence made space for healthy interaction, and the neighborhood slowly returned to a sense of balance and normalcy. Even the local journalist who had followed the story returned for a follow-up piece. I provided details of the resolution, emphasizing the importance of historical documentation, transparency, and patience in resolving disputes. The article highlighted the unique story of a 100-year-old lakehouse standing firm against bureaucracy and intimidation, and it attracted attention from a wider audience. People admired not just the house, but the way the situation had been handled with dignity and careful strategy. As the days passed, I realized something profound. The conflict had strengthened my connection to the property and the neighborhood. It had taught me the value of persistence, preparation, and patience, and had shown that even a single homeowner could protect their rights when armed with knowledge and careful planning. The Lakehouse was no longer just a home, it was a symbol of resilience, justice, and historical preservation. That evening I sat on the porch, the lake reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. The air was calm, the property secure, and the neighborhood at peace. Karen's chapter had ended, but the legacy of the Lakehouse, its history, beauty, and rightful ownership was stronger than ever. I allowed myself to smile, knowing that the fight had been long, but the victory was complete. With Karen gone and the HOA boundaries officially recognized, life at the Lakehouse finally felt peaceful. I turned my attention fully to restoring the property, honoring its century-long history while making it comfortable for modern living. Every room held echoes of the past, faded wallpaper, creaking floors, and fireplaces that had long gone cold. I approached the restoration with care, ensuring that original details were preserved whenever possible. I started with the exterior. The weathered siding and aged roof had endured decades of storms, but I wanted to maintain the historic aesthetic. Craftsmen were brought in who specialized in restoring old homes, using techniques and materials true to the original construction. Even the windows were carefully refurbished rather than replaced, preserving the charm and character of the Lakehouse. Walking along the property, I felt a deep connection to the generations who had called this place home before me. The interior was a different challenge. Rooms had been modified over the decades. Some partitions added, some original features covered or removed. I spent weeks uncovering hidden details, original hardwood floors under layers of carpet, a century-old fireplace mantel behind a wall, hand-carved woodwork around door frames. Each discovery was a reminder of the house's rich history and a validation of the care I was taking to honor it. Neighbors, who had once watched the HOA conflict unfold with apprehension, became enthusiastic participants in the restoration journey. Some shared photographs of the Lakehouse from decades past. Others told stories about family events, summer evenings by the lake, and quiet winter nights in front of the fireplace. Their memories added depth and color to the house's history, reminding me that it was more than just property, it was a repository of community memory. I also began work on the lakefront. The old dock had seen better days, but I rebuilt it carefully, using durable materials that blended seamlessly with the natural surroundings. I added subtle landscaping along the shoreline, planting native flowers and trees to enhance the serene environment while preserving the Lakehouse's original aesthetic. Even small details, like restoring the vintage outdoor lanterns, contributed to the overall atmosphere of historical authenticity. Friends and neighbors visited frequently, curious to see the progress. I hosted small gatherings where we shared meals, stories, and memories of the area. The Lakehouse became a center of connection and community, transforming from a contested property into a place of celebration. Children played along the shore, couples strolled around the grounds, and longtime residents marveled at the careful preservation of a house they had admired for decades. The local journalists returned for a feature on the Lakehouse restoration, capturing the blend of historical preservation and modern upgrades. Photos of the fully restored exterior, the refurbished interiors, and the tranquil lakefront were shared widely, and the story resonated with readers who admired not just the house, but the journey to protect and preserve it. The article highlighted the importance of patience, preparation, and dedication in safeguarding history. Even in quiet moments, walking along the lake at sunset, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The Lakehouse had weathered storms, bureaucratic overreach, and the arrogance of one particularly determined HOA president. Now, it stood restored, secure, and celebrated by the community. Every detail, from the hand-carved woodwork to the refurbished dock, reflected the care and respect that had gone into preserving its legacy. As night fell, the lake reflected the twinkling lights of the house and the surrounding trees. The air was calm, filled with the soft chorus of water lapping against the shore. I knew that this century-old Lakehouse, once threatened by disputes and intimidation, had now fully reclaimed its rightful place, not just on the land, but in the hearts of the community. It was a home, a symbol of perseverance, and a testament to the power of truth, patience, and careful planning. With the restoration complete and the Lakehouse fully secure, I decided to host a celebratory event for the community, a gathering to honor the history of the property, the neighborhood, and the triumph over the conflict that had dominated the past months. Invitations were sent to neighbors, local historians, journalists, and even longtime residents who had contributed their stories and photographs. The goal was simple: to share the house's story, celebrate its legacy, and create a sense of unity and closure. The day of the event arrived with perfect weather. The lake shimmered in the morning sun, reflecting the restored dock and gardens. Tables were set along the shoreline, adorned with flowers and photographs that traced the Lakehouse's century-long history. Inside the house, rooms were open to visitors, showcasing the careful restoration of woodwork, fireplaces, and other historical details. Every corner told a story, every artifact a memory waiting to be shared. Neighbors began arriving, some hesitant, some curious, others excited. The atmosphere was warm and convivial, a sharp contrast to the tension that had pervaded the neighborhood months earlier. People marveled at the restoration, pointing out details they remembered from decades past. Conversations buzzed with admiration and nostalgia, creating a sense of shared pride in the Lakehouse's history and resilience. I gave a brief speech recounting the journey from the initial purchase to the final acknowledgement of the property boundaries. I highlighted the importance of patience, documentation, and community support, emphasizing that the Lakehouse's preservation had been a collaborative effort, enriched by the contributions of neighbors, historians, and even the local media. The crowd listened attentively, nodding in agreement and clapping at key moments. The journalist who had covered the story returned to capture the event. Cameras and recording equipment documented the festivities, ensuring that the Lakehouse's history and the lessons learned would reach a wider audience. Residents shared their own anecdotes on camera, adding personal touches and creating a rich tapestry of memories that complemented the house's historical narrative. Karen was notably absent from the event, though her presence had been irrelevant from the start. The HOA's acknowledgement of the property boundaries had made her role obsolete. Without her interference, the community was free to appreciate the lake house for what it truly was: a historical gem, a symbol of perseverance, and a place for neighbors to gather and connect. Children played along the shoreline, skipping stones and laughing, while adults wandered through the rooms, pointing out restored details and reminiscing about past visits. The air was filled with a sense of accomplishment, camaraderie, and shared history. The lake house, once the center of conflict, had become the heart of the neighborhood, a place of celebration rather than division. As the sun began to set, the golden light reflected off the water, casting a serene glow over the restored property. I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Months of tension, legal battles, and careful preparation had culminated in this moment. The lake house had survived storms, disputes, and overreaching authority, and now it stood as a testament to resilience, justice, and community spirit. By the end of the evening, neighbors lingered, reluctant to leave, sharing food, stories, and laughter. The lake house had become more than a home. It had become a symbol of shared heritage and triumph over adversity. Walking along the water's edge later that night, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The century-old property, once threatened by bureaucratic overreach, was now a secure, celebrated, and cherished centerpiece of the community. For the first time since the ordeal began, I allowed myself to relax fully, knowing that the legacy of the lake house and the justice achieved would endure for generations. The house had been preserved, the neighborhood reconciled, and a century of history honored. After the celebratory event, it became clear that the lake house had become more than just a private residence. It was now a symbol of history, resilience, and community spirit. Inspired by the neighborhood's engagement, I began organizing efforts to preserve the property not only for myself but as a shared heritage site. I reached out to local historians, architects, and longtime residents to create a plan for ongoing maintenance, historical documentation, and public appreciation. I also proposed forming a small advisory committee made up of neighbors and experts to oversee the preservation of the property. This would ensure that the lake house's century-old features, including the woodwork, lakefront, and original architectural details, would remain intact for future generations. The community responded enthusiastically, eager to contribute and help protect a piece of local history. At the same time, I implemented subtle, thoughtful improvements to enhance the property's sustainability without compromising its historic charm. Solar panels were discreetly added to minimize environmental impact, rainwater was collected to irrigate the gardens, and native plants were cultivated along the lakefront to protect the shoreline from erosion. These measures preserved both the aesthetics and the ecological integrity of the lakehouse property. Throughout the process, I maintained open communication with neighbors. Weekly updates and tours were offered, allowing residents to see progress, ask questions, and contribute stories or photographs from the past. These small acts strengthened the community, building pride in the lake house as a shared historical and cultural landmark. The property had evolved from a source of conflict into a unifying centerpiece of the neighborhood. Even Karen's departure played a role in this new chapter. Without her interference, the HOA adopted a cooperative approach, respecting the lake house boundaries and supporting efforts to celebrate its history. Any lingering tension gradually faded as the focus shifted from disputes to preservation and appreciation. The HOA began including updates on the lake house in their newsletters, framing it as a point of pride for the entire neighborhood rather than a contentious issue. On my end, I reflected on everything that had transpired, The months of conflict had taught me invaluable lessons. The importance of patience, meticulous documentation, historical research, and community engagement. I realized that maintaining the lake house was about more than property rights. It was about protecting a legacy and ensuring that truth and integrity were respected in the face of intimidation. I also recognized the power of transparency. Every step I had taken, public meetings, open presentations, media coverage, had helped neutralize attempts to manipulate or intimidate. By keeping neighbors informed and involved, I had transformed potential opposition into allies and created a foundation for long-term support. The lake house was now more than a home. It was a living history project, a testament to perseverance, and a model for how communities could approach preservation collaboratively. Evenings at the lake house became moments of quiet reflection. Sitting on the restored porch, I watched the lake shimmer as the sun set, feeling a sense of accomplishment and peace. The water mirrored the sky's colors, the refurbished dock stood firm, and the century-old home glowed warmly. It was a place of harmony, resilience, and enduring history, a home that had not only survived over a century, but had thrived despite bureaucratic challenges and personal conflict. Looking ahead, I knew that the lake house would continue to serve as a symbol of patience, preparation, and integrity. It would remain a space where neighbors could gather, where history could be appreciated, and where the lessons of perseverance and justice could be shared. The struggles with Karen and the HOA had forged a stronger, more connected community and had ensured that the lake house's legacy would endure long into the future. The months of conflict, legal battles, and careful restoration had finally come to an end. Standing on the porch of the lake house, I could see the results of every decision, every effort, and every moment of patience. The lake reflected the late afternoon sun, shimmering across the restored dock and manicured gardens. The century-old home, once threatened by bureaucracy and intimidation, now stood proud, secure, and fully embraced by the community. The final acknowledgement of the property boundaries by the HOA, coupled with the resignation of Karen, had permanently removed any question of authority or jurisdiction. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, had transformed into a supportive and engaged community. Residents openly expressed admiration, shared historical insights, and participated in the ongoing preservation of the property. The lake house had become a centerpiece of local pride, a tangible link between past and present. I spent my days restoring, maintaining, and enjoying the house. Each room held stories of the past, and every architectural detail had been preserved or restored with care. The fireplaces, the woodwork, the lakefront gardens, all told a story of endurance and history. I organized guided tours for neighbors, historians, and students, sharing both the architectural significance of the property and the lessons learned from the months of conflict. The lake house had become a living classroom, a place to teach the importance of preparation, transparency, and community engagement. Evenings were the most serene. I often sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the lake, the water reflecting the sky's warm hues. The quiet was punctuated only by the gentle ripple of water against the dock or the occasional call of a bird returning to its nest. It was a far cry from the tense, confrontational atmosphere that had dominated the past months. The lake house was now a sanctuary, a testament to perseverance, and a space where history and modern life coexisted harmoniously. The journey had left a lasting impact, not just on the property, but on my perspective. I had learned the power of patience, meticulous documentation, and community engagement. I had experienced firsthand how intimidation and overreach could be countered through preparation, transparency, and clear communication. And most importantly, I had seen how a home, a piece of land, and a community could be preserved and strengthened through respect, integrity, and careful action. Neighbors continued to visit, sharing stories and adding artifacts, photographs, or documents to the growing historical record of the lake house. Local historians helped catalog the property's century-long history, ensuring that its story would be preserved for future generations. The lake house had evolved into more than a home. It was a symbol of resilience, collaboration, and justice, a landmark in the truest sense. On quiet nights, I reflected on the journey from purchase to full restoration and recognition. Karen's overreach, the legal challenges, and the HOA conflicts now seemed like distant memories. Each obstacle had been an opportunity to demonstrate perseverance and integrity. The lake house, standing firm through decades of history and the turbulence of recent months, had emerged stronger, its legacy secure. As I watched the moon rise over the lake, its reflection shimmering across the water, I felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The century-old lake house had survived storms, bureaucracy, and personal conflicts, and now it would endure for generations. It stood as a testament to the power of truth, preparation, and community support. And I, as its guardian, knew that the house's history, beauty, and rightful place in the neighborhood would remain protected forever. The lake house was no longer just a home, it was a legacy, a century-old treasure, preserved through persistence, care, and courage. And as the gentle waves lapped against the shore, I realized that every challenge, every confrontation, and every victory had been worth it. The house, the land, and the history were mine to protect, honor, and celebrate, and nothing would ever take that away.